Hi, how are you? I'm going to now deliver the What Makes a Strategic Communication Problem Wicked slide deck presentation. Um, I'm really only going to address one way in which strategic communication problems are wicked and focusing specifically on what it is that makes communication in general a wicked problem. And so if you have questions about any of this, by all means, feel free to add a comment below in the response. You're also free to email me or incorporate this into any of the things that you're working on for this particular week. Um, if you, as you're thinking about your own particular strategic communication challenge, identify other ways in which the problem of communicating your organization's goals to its prospective users is indeed a wicked problem, um, and it doesn't line up with what I'm saying here, that's fine. Like I said, this is only going to be sort of one way in which these types of strategic communication planning problems are indeed wicked problems. So first, just by way of review, from the Rattel and Weber reading, they outline what they call 10 distinguishing properties of planning type problems, i.e. wicked ones. They are, in the order that they're presented in the article, there is no definitive formulation of the problem itself. That is to say, when you are trying to frame the problem at the beginning, you're not able to come up with a definitive way of framing the problem. And this sort of goes to what I was saying at the beginning, which is to say, these are problems, they are wicked problems, but this is only one way of framing the difficulty or the wickedness of the problems for strategic communication. There's no stopping rule. That is to say, there is no definitive solution or end point for the addressing of a wicked problem. There's a resolution, but the resolution oftentimes comes because you, the problem solver, have made an arbitrary decision to stop, right? So there is no stopping rule that is not arbitrary and entirely bound by the person who is addressing the wicked problem. So solutions are good or bad instead of true or false. So this is, I think, something that many of you are comfortable with, the idea that there are many different ways to address these particular wicked problems, innumerable, in fact, ways to address a wicked problem. And some of them are just going to be better than others. And so this is sort of a qualitative judgment, almost an ethical judgment about the goodness or badness of a resolution to a wicked problem. The effects of addressing a wicked problem unfold over time, so there is no immediate or ultimate test of a solution. This is particularly important when you get into the analytics components of this particular program, because oftentimes analytics are going to be presented in sort of a sleight of hand way as, here's the ultimate test as to whether or not your campaign was successful. It increased click-through rates, or it increased X, Y, and Z. In terms of marketing, you might say, oh, well, the ultimate test is how many sales you get or how many services you sell or get subscriptions or what have you. And that's a good short-term goal, but it doesn't necessarily take into consideration long-term, how the effects of your marketing push might unfold over time. Solutions are at best one-shot operations. You're going to build up a library of ways to address wicked problems, and those are going to be exceedingly helpful as you try to address all manner of different kinds of wicked problems related to digital media strategy. That said, if you think that you're going to be able to create a boilerplate solution to just pick up and put down in another context, you're mistaken. So each time that you address a particular wicked problem, and oftentimes while you are attempting to address the same wicked problem, you're going to need to sort of reinvent the wheel, so to speak, over and over and over again. Not entirely from scratch, but each new problem has a new context that demands a unique addressing. There's no list of possible answers or possible resolutions. What we are talking about in this course with the roster method and PESO and all these different acronisms and initialisms are strategies to address problems. They are not solutions to the problem. So importantly, roster is a framework for thinking through a wicked problem. It is not a solution to a wicked problem. And this is because each problem is unique. And so while you can develop methodologies that you can pick up and move from problem to problem, you can't necessarily develop whole-scale solutions. So 5, 6, and 7 are all interrelated with each other, which is a good way of segueing into 8, which is that problems are interconnected. Oftentimes, as you dive deeper and deeper into a strategic communication planning problem, you're going to discover more and more things that you don't know or were unaware of or that you need to try to attend to. In other words, you're going to find more and more ways in which the problem, which you thought was wicked in one way, was actually wicked in a variety of different ways. Number 9 is the way that a problem is explained determines the solution. So going back to there's no definitive formulation, however you choose to formulate a problem is ultimately what's going to guide how you determine that particular solution. And so if you say that a marketing problem is a result of a lack of shared media or a lack of paid media or a lack of earned media, that ultimately is what's driving you to a potential solution. That is to say, we need more shared media, we need more earned media, we need more paid media, et cetera, et cetera. So how you frame or how you formulate the problem is ultimately what's going to help determine the resolution that you put forward. And this is the tough one to admit, is that you don't have a right to be wrong here as you address this particular wicked problem. That is to say, there's skin in the game. Yes, it is absolutely the case that wicked problems are not solvable, but they are resolvable. But you don't have the right to do it in a bad way. Because ultimately, if you do, you might end up exacerbating the wickedness of the problem or adding a new layer of wickedness to the problem, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about the Kylie Jenner example for Pepsi. Yes, this was a marketing ad to try to get people to drink Pepsi, but it also ultimately created a lot of backlash for the company because the ad was sort of tone deaf about the interests and what was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement at that particular time. All right, so this is the 10 distinguishing properties of planning type problems, i.e. wicked problems, as defined by Horst Rittel and Melvin Weber. So what I want to focus on now is how communication generally is a kind of a wicked problem. And then I want to sort of build on that basic understanding to address specifically how strategic communication planning is a very complicated, very wicked problem, right? But let's start with what good communication might look like. And I have some simple, basic drawings for you that I did just for you, right? So here is a model of good communication. You've got person A, so person A having a conversation with person B about trees. And person A is trying to describe an apple tree to person B. And so person A has a picture of an apple tree in their head. They use words to describe the image of that particular apple tree, and those words are heard and processed and understood by person B. We could say that if the picture of a tree that exists in person A's head is the same picture that is captured or rendered by the words that they say out loud, and is then therefore the same picture that gets planted into the head of person B, then communication has worked very well. This is sort of a transactional model of communication. It's very simplistic, very basic. It's not actually how communication oftentimes happens, because regularly what happens when people are communicating is I will have an idea in my head and I will be able to articulate that idea out loud with words, but how those words are picked up and understood by the person that I'm trying to talk to, there's some sort of a mismatch. So here you've got the image of the apple tree in person A's head, you've got the image of the apple tree as rendered by the words that person A says out loud, but for some reason person B is not able to apprehend or understand that image, and they are able to formulate a different picture of a tree in their head, but it doesn't match the picture that is represented by the words that person A says out loud, nor is it represented or does it match with the image of the tree that exists in person A's head. So here you've got an instance where what I'm thinking matches with what I'm saying, but doesn't match with what is being heard. All right? So there's a wickedness to that because we can't guarantee that the image that we render in words is going to be understandable to the people that we are trying to share those words with. All right? But it gets even further complicated by the fact that sometimes the image that we have in our head is not actually or accurately rendered by the words that we say out loud. And I think we've all had this experience when we're trying to get something out of our head, and we have some sense of what it is that we're trying to think, but we have difficulty in expressing it out loud with our words. And so the image that exists in our head is not matched by the image that is created by the words that we say out loud. And as a consequence, the image that is taken up by the person that we're talking to doesn't match either the image that we said, that rendered by the words that we said out loud, nor is it match the image that exists in our head. So there's this massive opportunity for miscommunication. There can be a mismatch between what I'm thinking and what I'm saying, but there can also be a mismatch between what I'm saying and the ideas that get implanted into the other person's head. All right? Now this is fundamentally what would be called the theory of speech acts. And there are two key philosophers that you can think of if you would like to, J.L. Austin and John Searle. They're philosophers of language. But basically, they break down speech acts into three parts. And the three parts, you don't necessarily need to remember the technical terms for any of these three parts, but I'm going to be using them throughout the course of this presentation, so it might be beneficial for you to pause the video now and then write down these definitions, these basic simplistic definitions, all right? So the three parts of a speech act are the illocutionary component, that is to say the intention behind the words, the meaning that I'm wishing to convey, the locutionary component, that is to say the words that I say out loud, and the perlocutionary component, that is to say the uptake or the understanding that the person that I'm communicating with has in their own heads. So good communication happens when the illocutionary matches the locutionary matches the perlocutionary, when the intention behind the words matches the words that I say and matches the uptake or the understanding of those particular words. All right. Now it gets fuzzy when we look back and consider some of the examples that we just had, right? So the previous example, the first moment, again, this is the moment of good communication, so the intention, the illocutionary matches the locutionary matches the perlocutionary. Here we've got a mismatch between the locutionary and the perlocutionary. There's a match between the words that I say and the intention behind them, but there's a mismatch between the words that I say and the uptake of them. Now you've got a mismatch between all three. So there's a mismatch between what I'm intending to say, what I actually say, and what somebody else hears or understands. Okay? So now the problem is, or I guess one way in which communication can happen and effectively, because you'd think, man, if there's all these opportunities for miscommunication to happen, there can be a mismatch between what I'm intending and what I'm saying and what I'm saying and what you're understanding, then how do we ever communicate with each other effectively? Well, we've designed this really good system of communication where if I say something out loud and you understand it, you can ask me a clarifying question. So if I say out loud, hey, check out this tree, and you say, by tree, do you mean this? I can say, no, I actually mean this. And you can say, oh, okay, I understand now. In other words, baked into the way that we communicate with each other in a face-to-face setting, we're able to self-correct. We're able to add clarification. We're able to ask questions to better understanding. And this is basically the experience of sitting in a sitting in a lecture, and you can say, hey, wait a minute, what did you mean by that? And the person who's lecturing or who's offering you information can tweak what they're saying or repeat what they're saying in such a way that you can understand it a little bit better. So here we've got an example. Person A has said what they wanted to say, and there's clearly some miscommunication. So person B asks a clarifying question. By tree, did you mean pine tree? And person A says, no, actually what I meant was apple tree. And say, oh, okay, I understand now, apple tree. And so here is fixed communication, right? So this is an example of miscommunication that was fixed by just asking a follow-up question. All right. One of the challenges, though, one of the things that makes this wicked problem is that you're not just conveying information. That is to say, the message that you are trying to communicate is more complicated than, hey, here's a tree. You're not just pointing something out to somebody. You're actually trying to get them to act in some particular way. And so the message might be as simple as, buy trees. And you say that out loud, and even if the words that you intend to say match with the words that you say out loud and are understood by the person that you're saying them to do, that is to say there's what's called felicity, a felicity condition between the illocutionary, the locutionary, and the perlocutionary, and all of those felicity conditions are met, the person that you're talking to might say no, right? So you might indicate to them, hey, I'd like you to go buy trees. And they say, buy trees? No way, trees killed my father. They fell on him in the forest. He was a lumberjack. I don't know, whatever, right? In other words, the thing that you are intending, not an understanding of the words that you are saying, but rather an action based on the words that you are saying, you go out and do this thing, might be ignored for any number of reasons, right? So one of the wickedness of this particular problem is that you're not just conveying simple messages, you're conveying complicated messages that are trying to get people to act. And so the message might be clear, understandable, and it might match your intentions, and people still might not do anything in response to it. So that's another additional layer that makes these strategic communication problems wicked. Another way, and probably one of the more pervasive ways in which these types of strategic communication problems are wicked, is the fact that you're not sitting down and having a face-to-face conversation with people. You're using, as the program is designed to be, digital media to convey messages, right? And so let's go to one of the more simplistic technologies that we as a human race have invented to communicate messages, and that is writing. So if I write down the message, buy trees, on a piece of paper, I'm able to communicate with you across time and across space. That is to say, I can fold up the letter and I can mail it to you, and you can be in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and you can get this message, and I don't need to be having a face-to-face conversation with you in order to tell you, hey, I think that you should buy trees. I write the message down, and then you read them. Now, importantly, there can still be a mismatch between the words that you intend to write, the words that you actually write, and the uptake of the words as they are read by your audience or your readers, okay? So that you can still have the original problem of miscommunication between the images not matching intention and words and uptake. But let's just assume for a second that they do. So you write down those particular words, you send them to somebody out in the world, they read them, they say, no way, I don't want to buy trees because buying trees causes inflation. I don't know, whatever their reasons might be. So you have the same problem as in this particular instance, but it's the added wrinkle is there's no guarantee that the words that you write down on the page will match the intention, will match the uptake, and even if they do, there's no guarantee that the action is going to be taken that you want to be taken, all right? But now it gets even further complicated because writing is just one mode of communication, and this program is focused on, and you've got a course that focuses on multimodal or multimedia communication. That is to say, you're not just going to be writing things down on a piece of paper and mailing it to somebody in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. You're going to be crafting very complicated multimodal video, audio productions like this. This thing that you are watching right now is a form of multimedia communication. I'm just trying to provide information for you, but I'm doing it through a variety of different modes. You can hear my voice, you can see my face, you can see the drawings, there's words on it. So we've got at least 4 different modes here. We've got the mode of visual or video, you've got the mode of audio, you've got the mode of images or static images, you've got the mode of written language. You'd also, if you're paying attention to the way that I'm gesturing, and at least my camera is not responding to me like it does when we're zooming together, you've got the gestural mode as well, all right? So this is complicated. This becomes more and more wicked, right? So if you are trying to create some type of multimodal message to convince somebody to buy trees, again, think of all of the felicity conditions that need to be met. It's not just that the intention that is in your head has to match the words that you write down. It also has to be matched by and mirrored by the images that you choose to put into it. It has to be matched or mirrored by the sound that you choose to incorporate into it, the language that you choose to incorporate into it, the words that you are saying out loud, if you are saying any words out loud. And all of this must be assembled together such that the words, i.e. the different modes of communication that you use in the message, match the intention in your head and are understandable and understood by the person who is receiving them. In this particular instance, even if all of those different felicity conditions are met, the message might still not be acted upon for a variety of different reasons. So in these previous 2 reasons, no, I don't want to buy trees because I have misgivings about buying trees. They killed my father. No, I don't want to buy trees because doing so will improve inflation. But what if the message is understood, all of the different felicity conditions are met, but still the action is not taken because they can't afford to take it? In other words, you've created a perfectly good message with different modes of message making, different modes of communication, but you've sent it to the wrong people, people who aren't going to be able to afford the thing that you are trying to get them to buy, all right? So here's another way in which these problems, these strategic communication planning problems, are wicked. Even if all felicity conditions are met for the communication, and even if the message is clearly understandable, and even if there is a desire to do the thing, there might not be a capability in the people that you are trying to communicate with. In other words, you might have misidentified the right audience. What if you craft a message and it's just not understandable because the person doesn't get doesn't understand, doesn't speak your language, doesn't understand some of the jokes that you know, think about the generational gaps between how folks communicate on Instagram or communicate via text messages, things like that. You know, how many times have you received a text message from a parent where they put a full stop period at the end of what they say and you're like, oh geez, are you pissed at me? Like, what's going on here? Or how many different ways in which a meme just is not understandable by some older generation, right? Because it's participating in a form of humor that makes sense to you but doesn't make sense to them. And so again, all felicity conditions might be met. The intention of what you are trying to communicate is communicated accurately by the different modes of communication that you use. It's put out on the correct channels. It reaches the correct audience, but there's some lost in translation component. Either literal lost in translation, they speak a different language, they read a different language, they listen to a different language, or some, they're not quite getting your references or something like that. So again, felicity conditions met, miscommunication can still happen. By the way, these are not isolatable instances. All of these things can happen at the same time, right? In other words, you can craft a message where the illocutionary component of the message, your intention, doesn't match the words that you use or the modal meaning makings that you use, and isn't taken up in the way that you want it to be taken up, and is in fact resisted and misunderstood. And that happens more often than all of than perfect communication happens, right? So miscommunication happens significantly more often than perfect communication does. So here's a quick summary. What is it that makes all of these strategic communication planning problems wicked? One, the uptake, the way that the person that you're trying to communicate with understands what it is that you're trying to communicate, doesn't match the words that you use or the intention that you use. In other words, the message that you craft is not understood by the person that you're crafting it to. Or the message that you create doesn't match the intention. Now, also keep in mind that I didn't even talk about the fact that in terms of the intentionality behind the message, there's your intention as the crafter of the message, and you might shoot a video or create a website or something like that, but there's also your client's intention. And so there can be a misunderstanding of what the intention behind the message is. You might not understand what your client wants the message to read like. You might have your own picture of what the message is. But regardless, the words that you use or the modes that you use to communicate might not match the intention behind the message. Or there can be just a full-scale breakdown. The uptake, this should say uptake, not update, but the uptake doesn't match the words that you say and also doesn't match the intention that you have behind those words or those modes of meaning making. There is no opportunity for clarification. So because you're not working in a face-to-face communication mode, you are working with quick, digital communication, websites, Instagram ads, Facebook ads, videos, et cetera, you won't have an opportunity to clarify for somebody if they're not really understanding. You can provide them opportunities, but it's not going to be instantaneous. And oftentimes, people aren't going to spend the energy to try to ask a clarifying question. They're just going to assume that they understood it correctly the first time around. So no opportunity for clarification. Importantly, just because felicity conditions for your message might be met, which is no guarantee, that is to say, just because the uptake matches the words, matches the intention, doesn't mean that you're going to be able to convince the person that you're trying to convince to actually act, because it's a more complicated behavior to act on an understanding than it is to understand something. I understand what you mean when you say the words buy trees, but I don't want it buy trees for any number of a variety of reasons, which hopefully you will be able to suss out as you do research. The message itself might not be understandable for any number of different reasons. In other words, there's a lost in translation component to the message. So the intention could match the words that you use. The words could be understood in a sort of semantic way. I understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, but I don't know what it is that you're trying to intimate or you're trying to suggest, or I don't quite get the references that you are making. All right? So the message itself could also be easily misinterpreted. That is to say, you craft a message which maybe is understandable and maybe provides a solid sort of reason to act or way of acting, but itself might be easily misinterpreted, misunderstood, or intentionally misinterpreted or misunderstood. Okay? So thus concludes the overall statement in regards to wicked problems as it relates to strategic communication. And again, we're just focusing on the communication element of strategic problems and what makes them wicked. There are a number of other things which are sort of hinted at in this list. That is to say, there's going to be cultural issues that generate the wickedness and problems. There's going to be technology components that add wickedness to problems. There's going to be generational components. There's, in other words, a whole bunch of demographic, psychographic information about you, the communicator, and the people that you are trying to communicate with. But there's also going to be a lot of related to the desire, the awareness and the interest and the desire of the people that you're trying to communicate with. How are you going to successfully communicate or persuade them to engage in a particular activity? Okay, so based on that, go ahead and think about the assignments that you're working on. Think about your own clients. What are some of the things, and it could be these, what are some of the things that the features or the characteristics of that strategic communication problem that makes it a wicked problem? And keeping in mind, going back to the original slide, how do you frame it or formulate that problem in such a way that you can help determine a potential solution, right? So as you're writing your wicked problem briefs, think about ways in which you can identify a wicked problem that that particular client is facing that would suggest to them a particular course of action or a solution, right? So I look forward to reading your wicked problem briefs. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below and I'll get to them as soon as I see them, or you can send me an email or shoot me a text. All right? All right, I'll see you all later. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.